Hello, welcome back to Thinking Like a Geographer. This is week number 4, and this is our agriculture unit. I wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of explain a little bit about why we lay out the course this way. There is no particular course sequence that is required by the College Board. This is one that I have used as long as I have taught the course. It's kind of handed down to me this way from um, a mentor that I kind of learned a lot about the course, Katrina Granquist, who's now playing at East High School. And basically, the way that we have kind of laid it out is that we start with kind of the individual and understanding the individual and individual's relationship to the world. So we start with politics. With population. Then we go into culture, and then we go into politics, which are all about the individual identity, individual characteristics of people, and then a little bit of groups of people and how they interact with each other. And then week 4 in this case, or unit 4, or 5 if you count the kind of traditions and geography unit, the agriculture unit, wherever that is. Marks kind of a shifting philosophically from the individual and the micro level analysis to kind of some macro level things, looking at how things look on a large global scale and some of those larger global interactions. And that's kind of what we're going to start looking at today with agriculture. So that's kind of the mindset or the idea behind why we make this shift. We're going to continue to make that shift next week when we do industry, and then the following week when we do urbanization. So this is week 4. We do have 6 of these, so we'll have 2 more after this, and that will leave you with a week or two after the course is content has been disseminated for you to kind of work. And obviously these videos are recorded. You should have some access to the course modules and some of the activities on there after we're through. So I don't feel like that's going to limit you in that way. So the one thing that I would like to start with today is the idea that I was talking about agriculture. Remember that questions are great for this particular MOOC, for this course. Comments and things like that on the message board are also good. Hopefully you've had some conversations on there, and I'll weigh in at some point and kind of give some feedback to some of those as needed. So. All right, so we're going to get started with agriculture. So I want to start once again today with a few questions. And once again, Christina has posted, looks like 2 questions today. Once again, keep those questions coming in. Next week will be industry, so kind of read ahead and be able to ask questions if you feel you need to. But Christina has 2 questions that we're going to talk about. I'll talk about both of those briefly before we move into some bigger things. So the first one talks about what are the most important things to know about the agricultural revolution? Okay, so before we get directly to what to remember about them, let's talk a little bit about the idea of revolution in general. So before I taught human geography, I taught world history. I still do. I've taught world history for about 12 years now. And revolution is a very important concept in world history. And when we look at revolutions, what we want to look at them in terms of cause and effect relationships. So what's causing a change to occur in a particular phenomenon or group of people and their behavior, and then what is the effect of that? And so that's what we want to talk about. So for example, if we were to look at the American Revolution and the political revolution that brought about the government structures and the country that became the United States, we want to look at some of those causes. So we could look at the British allowing colonies to have independent democratic organizations like the House of Burgesses. We could look at some of the benevolent neglect in terms of economics that were going on in the colonies over the course of 150 years. We could look at some of those changes in terms of taxation or in terms of enforcement of taxes that went on in the 1760s, 1770s. We could look at the French and Indian War and some of those kind of events that kind of got the colonists thinking about their relationship with Britain even more. We could talk about the Enlightenment and the influence of the Enlightenment thinkers and how all of those things led to an eventual desire for change. And then we could look at the effects of that. So we could look at the Constitution, we could look at the Revolutionary War, we could look at everything that's happened since then in some ways as being a consequence of those actions. So when we talk about revolution, once again, we want to keep this cause and effect relationship in mind. All right, so let's talk a little bit about these agricultural revolutions. So, and this is where being coming from a history background really comes in handy. So, when we talk about agricultural revolution, we're talking about the first one is probably the most important one to think about. Well, the first and the third probably are pretty important, but the first one happens anywhere from 8 to 12,000 years BC or BCE. We don't know the exact dates, but we do kind of get some ideas of when this kind of phenomenon started. And to understand what's important and the impact of this revolution, you have to understand what came before. So prior to the agricultural revolution, people lived pretty much in small groups of 10, 20, maybe 30 at the most. They're small little tribal groups. They stuck together. They survived as nomadic peoples who hunted and gathered. So the males of the clan or the tribe would hunt, the females would gather, and basically it was a subsistence lifestyle based on hunting and gathering. Now, there are some very interesting things about this particular lifestyle. One is, while men were the hunters, women were actually responsible for creating the most stable food supply. Sometimes men would go out and hunt and would not be able to catch anything for days or weeks. And so sometimes they may go days or weeks without animal protein in their diet, at least. Maybe fish, but that was about it. So most of the time during this hunting and gathering period, the dependability and stability and of the food supply came from what women could gather. So in these early civilizations, there was this problem. People were able to get enough food usually, as long as they kept their groups, their clans kind of small. The problem began to occur, though, when seasons would change, when the food supply would shift, or things like that. So the problem was that it was an unstable food supply. You couldn't always count on it. You couldn't always count on having the same caloric intake or the same sources of food. So it was always this uncertainty out there. So while these civilizations were relatively egalitarian in terms of the way that men and women fit into society, they were very, very tenuous and very strained in terms of their available food supply, at least having it consistent. It was actually, in terms of amount of labor, a relatively easy life compared to what comes later. Hunting and gathering took place during certain times, and then once you met what you needed in terms of your caloric intake, you were good. Have the rest of the day to carve on walls, or I don't know what prehistoric people did, but that's what they did. But anyway, so at some point, these little groups, probably the women of these groups actually, which is kind of ironic for several reasons, and that their roles drastically change after they make this discovery, kind of started to figure out, well, if food grows near rivers, or it grows near ponds and fresh water, and we know that food grows there, and we can come back every year and gather things here. What if we could control that process? What if we could find a way to make this food grow near the water in ways that we could control? And that's what led to agriculture. And the first agricultural revolution, or what we call the Neolithic Revolution, was this shifting from hunting and gathering to more advanced um, agriculture. When agriculture started, there was a stable food supply. As long as you could control it, and as long as you had access to fresh water, you could guarantee a certain amount of food. And this, the physical labor was much harder in agriculture, the food supply was more dependable. And so people began to say, okay, this is probably a better way to live. And over the course of thousands of years, more and more and more of these little groups, these little tribes, began to adopt these practices and began to settle together into larger and larger groups, creating what we now know as civilization. This process started in a couple of different places. It was thought to have first started in what is now the nation of Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates Valley and what we call the Fertile Crescent. It also is thought to have started independently in Southeast Asia, in the area of what is now Myanmar and Thailand. And it is also thought to have started independently in Central America, in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, this area. So all three of these areas, people came up with these ideas independently, that it makes more sense to be able to control and stabilize your food supply. So the effects, or the cause of the first agricultural revolution is this need for a stable food supply and a dependable food supply. The effects of that revolution is civilization. So I don't know that there's anything in world history or in human geography that's necessarily could be said as any more important than this particular event or series of events. And keep in mind that this happened over thousands of years. It wasn't like one day they were hunters, the next day, they're growing corn. It happened over a very slow process. But this transformation and this revolution that occurred was probably the most important event in human history in terms of what happened after that, which was for human beings kind of everything in terms of civilizations and societies. So that's the first agricultural revolution. And what you want to remember about that is the first development of agriculture, the first attempts at farming, understand a little bit about how gender roles changed. So when agriculture became the primary economic activity of these peoples, women's roles were decreased within society, because men took over a lot of those physical activities, and the economy was so closely tied to that, they then became much more influential in decision-making power. So those gender roles shifting, and then of course the overall just kind of building and growth of civilization from there, from hunting and gathering to skyscrapers over the course of a couple thousand years. So it's huge impact. The other thing that's kind of impactful about it is the basic principles of agriculture have not changed since then. Now there are differences in the way we do things now versus then, and some improvements, but overall it's the same thing. We find land that's good, we dig a hole, we put in some seeds, we water it, we give it sunlight, kind of like the whole Little Shop of Horrors song, I've given you sunshine, I've given you dirt kind of thing. Anyway, but the process is the same, just with some modifications. So that's the first one, and we want to keep that in mind. The second one, and what we call the second, third, fourth, whichever agricultural revolution we're talking about, is a little different depending on which book you're looking at or who you're talking to. The second one, as I have always taught it, occurs during the Middle Ages, and I'm going to say it's not all that important. It is, but in the big picture of things, it's not. So one of the things that kind of marks these characteristics of these different revolutions is the role of technology. So in the Middle Ages, in the 14th to 12th, 13th, 14th century, especially in Western Europe, they begin to, and China and India also, they begin to kind of experiment with some different types of technology, more efficient plowing techniques, crop rotation, the three-field system, where they are being very conscious of maintaining and preserving the the quality of the soil to keep it alive longer. So that's kind of what happens there. But it's about technology, and that's true of all these revolutions. It's what role does technology play? The third agricultural revolution happens prior to and during the Industrial Revolution, and that's also a very important thing to remember. So at the end of into the 17th century into the 18th century, there's some pretty significant changes in Europe in terms of technology. So one is that things like the seed drill and some things like that allow for farms to be worked and to produce food with less human labor. Machines can now displace labor. In the Industrial Revolution, this becomes the norm in most industries. But it starts with agriculture. So we can now we now need fewer people out in the fields working. We can get our seed into the ground. We can get it cultivated. We can get it fertilized. We can get it sun and water in a much more efficient manner because of technology. What this ends up doing to farms is that the amount of farm labor required drastically falls. And so many farm laborers, not farm owners, but farm laborers, leave farms and migrate to cities, which starts the big industrial boom of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. So that's kind of the second one. And once again, it's that idea of what does I'm sorry, that's the third one, excuse me. That is, what does technology do? If we continue that same industrialized line, we get into 20th century developments, and we get into more and more mechanization, more and more machines being used, more and more efficiency. It changes land use patterns, so small farms begin to shrink and disappear while large corporate commercial farms are going to grow, and we'll see a lot more of that continuing to happen. So those are kind of the three major industrial or agricultural revolutions. Once again, those cause and effect relationships are important, but also keeping in mind, if you're comparing across those revolutions, think about the impact and technology. So what types of technology are new to each one? How does it change the farming methods? And the answer is, in general, very little, but it does have some impact. And then what are kind of some of those long-term effects or impacts? Now, where some of this gets a little confusing is when we talk about the Green Revolution, which is an incredibly important concept for this unit. And do we kind of tie in the Green Revolution with that third one, or is it something separate? I usually treat it as something separate, because the Green Revolution is doing something different, and that it is about science and technology, but it's not so much about changing the implementation or the process of farming. It's much more about changing the product. So, for example, the Green Revolution develops in the 1950s, 30s, 40s, 50s in the United States and the West as a response to overpopulation and trying to find some ways to provide more food to overpopulated areas. So India and China benefit from this technology greatly. And what they do with the Green Revolution is they actually take seeds, crops, grains, and they manipulate them at a genetic level. So at the most basic human life level. They manipulate their DNA to make changes that are beneficial to humans, or at least that's the idea. So, for example, we may produce rice that has more caloric intake. We may produce wheat that has a shorter stalk and therefore can stand up in high winds or high rains. You may it may be more drought resistant, so you can plant it in places that have fewer and fewer water resources. Enabling for places that did not have access to these kinds of crops, or maybe were very problematic, to produce more on the same amount of land. And that's the big crucial thing here, is we cannot make more land, so we have to find ways to get more out of what we have. And so the Green Revolution allows you to do that. You should be familiar with the pros and cons of the Green Revolution. So there's pros in terms of we're able to produce more food, so fewer people starve to death. And some people would argue whether that's good or bad. I argue that fewer people dying of starvation is always a good thing. But some people might disagree. Or some people in biology raise some interesting and I think valid points about some of those things. So that's a positive. There are some negatives that go along with it. One of the negatives is because the research for this is done kind of by corporations. There's a profit incentive to these products, and so a lot of times the seeds and things like that are very, very expensive. So only wealthier farmers or corporate farms or kind of agribusiness firms often are the ones that are limited to being able to implement it. So your small subsistence farmers, you don't see them able to use to gain access to these things. It also requires an immense amount of water. I know I talked about drought resistant, but it still often requires a lot of irrigation to create the right moisture level for many of these crops to grow. It does require more fertilizers, more pesticides, more chemicals going into the process. And is that good or bad? That's it is what it is. You could argue that that's a good thing, or it's not a harmful thing, but you also could argue that the more inputs you have to have, the higher the cost, and once again that limits the availability of these things. Also, as we look back historically at whether or not this has been an effective program, what we've found is that it is effective in places that have certain types and qualities of soil. If your soil is not good, the Green Revolution will not help you very much, because you simply cannot get enough nutrients into the ground in order to make it work. So really what it does is it takes areas that are have the quality but not the capacity, and it increases that capacity. It does not do much for places that have marginal resources. So places like Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, parts of Latin America have done very well with these programs. Sub-Saharan Africa has not. Their soil is not the same quality. Tropical soils are by their nature a little lower quality, and so there's been some struggles with that. That being said, that creates all kinds of problems, because there is this issue with population growth in sub-Saharan Africa being very, very high, and so there needs to be something done to try to curb that population and at the same time try to provide for it. And the Green Revolution to this point has been less effective there than in other places, and so that's a concern. There are also some cultural concerns with the Green Revolution, because this does involve kind of manipulating natural biological things on a genetic level. Some people have some ethical concerns with that. There's also some concerns about, are these GMOs, these genetically modified organisms that we are planting and growing and putting into food, are they safe? Do we know what the long-term impacts of these genetically modified varieties and things are? And I don't know what the research says on that. I know that there's a lot of people that are worried about that, and I don't know that there's a lot of evidence that can clarify that either way. So if you have concerns about GMOs, I have no evidence to tell you not to be worried about it. And if you're not worried about it, I have no evidence to tell you otherwise. But I do know that there are some cultural concerns in some places about the use of these types of things, and not just in the developing world, but also here in the U.S. and Western Europe and the developed world. We also have some of those same problems. So, all right. So, Christina, that's my much too long probably attempt to explain the major agricultural revolutions, and both what you need to know about them in terms of individually, but also what you need to know about them in terms of comparing them across. So looking at those cause and effect relationships, look at the technological differences that occur, and also look at the impact of those things. So be able to kind of talk about those. Okay? All right. So Christina had one more question, and I wanted to go ahead and address that also, and that is, what is the isolated state model? And so when we talk about the isolated state, so I assume that you're talking about the isolated state in reference to the von Thunen model. I've never actually heard it referred to as the isolated state model, but it's an important part of von Thunen's assumptions. So let's kind of talk about von Thunen a little bit. What he's trying to do and what he's trying to lay out and what he's trying to explain, and how eerily and just amazingly accurate I think he is even today. So when we talk about von Thunen, I believe he was Dutch. Not exactly sure, but he's somewhere of European Germanic origins, as a lot of our model makers are. And what von Thunen is trying to understand is, are there patterns to the way that rural land is used, divided, and distributed? So can we look at lots of different places where agriculture is done, and can we devise any patterns from those usages? And so he spent lots of time studying this in the 1850s. So I'm talking about 150 years ago. And what he came up with was this interesting model. It's a concentric ring model. So it has a center point, a center point, and then it has rings that go out from there in successively larger rings as you move out. And basically what his model kind of came up with was this idea that how land was used was kind of related to a couple of factors. It was related to the perishability of what was being grown or produced. So if it was likely to spoil or go bad quickly, it was going to be closest to the market. It also assumed some transportation issues. So the more expensive transportation would be, or the longer it had to be transported, that it had some effect on what was there. Also, the amount of land. When we look at the outer rings of von Thunen, we're talking about things like large-scale grain production, large-scale livestock ranching, things that require a lot of land. And because, as we'll talk about in a later unit, land gets more expensive as you move closer to the center of this model, the more land you need, the further out you want to be. So von Thunen kind of discovered is in that very first ring outside of the city is going to be things like fruits and vegetables and things that have a very high level of perishability. The next ring out would be things like dairying, where your products have a little longer shelf life but still need to get to market fairly quickly. The next layer out might be something like large-scale grain production, so wheat and corn might be the next layer out. And then the farthest layer out would be things like ranching, livestock, things like that. And the amazing thing about von Thunen is that if you look at modern day distribution of these kinds of things, you see some of these same patterns still exist. For example, if we assume that New York City is the United States' one market, and as he does, then what you see is you can see some of those kind of things happen. You see where the U.S. dairy industry is based, kind of right there around New York, and in the far upper Midwest, and the grain belt, the prairie belt, is where all the grains are produced. All the livestock and cattle is kind of produced. Way out west, where the soil is not as good and where agriculture is difficult because of the dry conditions. So you can look at actual places and map these things, and it's similar. It's not exactly. Nothing is perfectly concentrically ringed, but you do have some of these models, and it's very interesting to see that. I encourage you. I don't have any visuals today, but I encourage you to go look at some pictures of this. Look in your textbooks, look in your prep books, look online, and look at some of these comparisons. There's a really great shot of our image of Uruguay, and how Uruguay kind of maps this implied kind of pattern. All right, so that's kind of the basics of von Thunen. Now, one of the things that you want to remember is that all models have to make some assumptions, because we can't control for every variable in human geography. It's a social science, and in social science, we just have too many variables to compare for. So we try to negate as many as we can and just kind of ignore others that we don't feel are important to making this happen. And there's a considerable list of things that von Thunen kind of just assumes and holds as, well, we're not going to worry about this, we're not going to worry about this. And I think you picked a pretty good group based on the accuracy of the model today. But two of the I think important things is that one is that every use of the model has one market that is at the center of the distribution pattern. So one town or one major city, one place where those products are consumed, right? And that's important because you want to make sure that in order to create these concentric rings, you have to have one center point where everything's coming out. If you have multiple cities, which is actually more likely to be true, then that's going to skew your distribution slightly. However, if we look at things like primate city rules or gravity model and some things that kind of predict the interactions of kind of these major cities, then maybe that doesn't have the same impact. But so he does assume this one central market. So in the Uruguay example, obviously Montevideo, which is the capital, is that central market. In the U.S. example, I talked about New York being that central market. Excuse me. The other thing to keep in mind, and one of the other assumptions, and he made several, he assumes things like uniform soil quality. So he assumes that that every point going out within this circle has relatively equal quality. So they're not, basically he's saying that farmers aren't making choices about where to plant things based on the soil quality. They're doing it based on perishability and transportation and land use and land cost. Now, is that true? I think you could argue that may not always be the best assumption. But once again, this model tends to hold true. He also assumes that the circles or the model that we're looking at takes place on a flat plane that is uninterrupted. So there's no hills, there's no valleys, none of that kind of stuff. That would skew kind of the distribution. Once again, not necessarily completely realistic, but once again, the model still holds a lot of relevance today. One of the other assumptions, which is kind of the heart of, I think, the question here, is the idea of the isolated state. And what that means is that, once again, remember our definition of state last time was that, well, I guess it depends on how we define state, but the idea of isolation, and isolation is the important word there, meaning that this set of concentric rings, this land and its distribution is not interacting with anything outside. So there's no outside markets, there's no outside influences, there's nothing coming in and out. It's a closed system, for lack of a better word, right? And that's the assumption, because when you have those other influences coming in and out, then that might change that distribution or change how those things are done. And you may think, wow, these are some pretty severe assumptions. We're assuming a lot that doesn't really bear out in the real world. Well, once again, I encourage you to go look at some of those real-life examples and see the pattern. Once again, it's not concentric rings, but there are those noticeable patterns are there, and I think that that's important. So the other question that I think comes up about the von Thunen model is, this is a 150-year-old model, and a lot has changed since then. How does that affect us? Well, it does and it doesn't. It does in some ways. It affects us in some ways in that we do not have to rely on our food being locally sourced anymore. Some people think that that's really important, and having locally sourced food is kind of a way of life for some people, and that's great. That's definitely a thing. but we don't have to do that anymore. So we don't have to think about the von Thunen model as having to describe every situation. So especially here in the developed world where we live, we can get food from other places. We can get, fruits and vegetables from South America out of season. We can get, dairy products that can be transported much, much further because of refrigerated transportation. So refrigeration, pasteurization, pesticides, fertilizers, preservatives allow food to be taken much, much, much further than it could before. So I think if we were to ask von Thunen today, he's not still alive. He would be very old, like 200 years old or something. About his model today, and if you would add any assumptions, you would probably add to those assumptions assuming X type of technology, assuming X type of resources and things like that. So you'd probably say that my model is still effective, but there are things that make it less applicable. So, all right. So that's the idea of von Thunen. Von Thunen is very interesting to me. I think the way that he kind of works out and plays out. So, all right. So those were the two questions, and I've spent 40 minutes looking at questions, and that's plenty of time for those. But thank you for those questions. I believe those were both from Christina. So thank you, Christina, for your questions. I feel like you are like the awesome question asker person. You always have good questions to ask, so keep them coming. And I encourage all of you to contribute the questions to the question board so we can discuss them next week. All right. So let me go over a couple of things that, since I have about 10 more minutes here, let's go ahead and discuss a few other things. One of the things that I encourage you to do, and your teachers may have done this with you already, is to go and find a map of climate regions, and then find a map of agricultural regions. And I want you to kind of look at those things and overlay those patterns. I think you'll find it interesting to see that those patterns are very, very similar, and that the types of agriculture that we see on the Earth is very similar to the types of climate. Or just to put that another way, that climate does a lot to determine the types of agriculture that can be done. So for example, in places like South Asia and East Asia, we see a lot of what we call intensive subsistence. And part of that is climatic, but part of that is also population. So also taking a population density map and overlaying that also provides, I think, an interesting perspective into this. So looking at those different agricultural regions. So things like intensive subsistence, which is where people literally spend hours and months and months and months trying to provide enough food for their community and themselves. And a lot of developing and transitional countries find themselves in subsistence. Developing more because they just don't have the resources to do better or to improve or produce more. And in some transitional countries because of population. So China and India are subsistent because they just have to produce so much food for so many people that they're not really able to even think about the idea of selling it. So kind of be looking at some of those distribution patterns. They're very important to understanding the types of what happens where, and those are the types of questions that AP will definitely ask, is, explain these distribution patterns. The other thing to think about, or another thing to think about, is the idea of commercial agriculture and what regions are commercial, and what does that mean for the people involved. So at the end of the day, if you're involved in subsistence, you're subsistent, but you do walk away with a portion of your crops to provide for your family. If you're involved in commercial agriculture, that's not always the case. Often you become a market actor like everybody else, and you have to buy and sell your food products a lot too. So, excuse me. You also want to think about agricultural hearths, like I talked about 3 of those earlier, in terms of Mesopotamia or the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and what is now Iraq. We talked about the Myanmar, slash Thailand area of Southeast Asia and Central America. So be thinking about those hearths and how agriculture spreads. And what's important to remember about agricultural spreading is it's not necessarily the crops themselves. So it's not like people taught people how to plant corn. They may have done that, but ultimately, if you look at the spread of these things, the foods that become staples of those diets are not the same. So what really is important about the diffusion of agriculture is not the types of crops, but the processes and the methods that are spread. So I ran in, I met these traveling nomadic peoples, and they told me about, planting things, and I tried to plant what they planted, and it didn't work. And when I tried to plant this other thing, it worked really well. So the idea of the diffusion being tied to the process and the methods more than the specific crops. The crops are going to be whatever works in a particular place. Think about the ideas of kind of agribusiness and how agribusiness has kind of changed the way that we do the food business, and the whole idea that food is a business now, especially in our country. So what kind of changes has agribusiness brought? And in many ways, you could think about this as being yet another industrial or agricultural revolution. This idea that small farms being bought out by large corporate farms, some changes in decisions about planting being made more about profit than necessarily about what's best to plant. For example, if I know that corn is what's selling, I may plant more corn. The idea of monocropping is a big deal in agribusiness. And monocropping is where entire fields are planted with one crop. And because it's easier to account for, to harvest, and it's much more efficient. There are some downsides to that. One is biodiversity, which actually makes the crops kind of weaker and more susceptible to pests and diseases when you don't have a diversity of crops. So monocropping is an issue. That idea of vertical integration of companies owning the entire process from the farm all the way up. The idea of people not living on their land, not living on the land they farm, but just owning it, and they may see the land once a year when they bring in the big combines and harvesters to do that. And what does that do to kind of the culture and the sense of place of those locations when that happens? So thinking about that idea of agribusiness and what that means. What are the byproducts, and how does that affect us? Once again, I like food. I don't personally look for reasons not to like food, but we do need to be conscious of both sides of some of these equations. So be thinking about agribusiness and its impacts. Be thinking also about the idea of sustainability. And one of the big issues or concerns with agribusiness and with kind of commercial farming on the large scale is that it uses resources in what many people believe to be an unsustainable way. So the idea of sustainability really comes into play with that. And are we growing food and producing food in ways that puts other aspects of our environment or our livelihoods in danger or at a higher threat? So that becomes an issue also to consider in the long run when we talk about agribusiness and things like that. So, but be thinking about those things. In general, some of the things that I've seen in terms of some of the response questions, there are several on agriculture. Some of them look at von Thunen. One looks at von Thunen, and there's one that looks about von Thunen kind of in a couple of different ways. There's one about shifting cultivators, which is a form of subsistence, which is very interesting. So you may want to go back and look at those for response questions as you continue to work through the MOOC modules. So, in general, also you'll want to know not a lot, but be familiar with different types of agriculture. So when you look at that map that I asked you to go track down and find of agricultural regions, take a look at it and look at, okay, what does it mean to be Mediterranean? What does it mean to be intensive subsistence? What does it mean to have a market gardening system? What does it mean to have commercial grain production? What does plantation farming mean? So look at our wet rice production, or swaha, whatever you want to call it, intensive subsistence or shifting cultivation. Make sure that you're relatively familiar with what those things are and the differences between them. And they're pretty lengthy, so I don't want to go through all of those things today. But do make sure that you can give some examples of crops or methods that are used and kind of why people do that as you're moving forward. So, okay, I don't have much else to really talk about. I usually talk a lot more about this topic, but I feel like we've covered some questions that I think covered most of that, and so I just want to leave you with a couple of things to remember. One is that there are lots of resources available on the MOOC. You have your multiple choice questions, you have your sample FRQs, you have the College Board FRQ bank that you can pull, that you can use and interact with. Remember that if you have your questions in, if you have your sample responses in by, I believe, Sunday, you can get some feedback from other students on that. Also, remember to be asking questions on the discussion board so that we can talk about those next week. Okay, next week will be industry and economic development, which is also a very, very interesting topic that I like talking about a lot. Maybe my most favorite right now. And so we'll talk about that. So go ahead and read ahead, skim ahead, read, go through your vocabulary for that, and ask lots of good questions so we can be ready to go next week. All right, that's all I have for today, and we'll see you.